Welcome to the Billionaire's Choice. Subscribe and turn on notifications to enjoy more heartwarming stories of love and destiny. Let us know where you're watching from, and let's begin today's story. The most life-changing lies never begin with deception. They begin with desperation. Meredith Hale stared at the glowing notification on her phone until the words blurred together. 10-year class reunion. Saturday, 7 o'clock. Grand Magnolia Hotel. She had ignored the invitation for weeks, hoping silence would somehow erase it. But tonight the group chat exploded with photos, countdowns, and cheerful promises to reconnect after a decade. Every new message tightened the knot in her stomach. Ashley had posted a picture with her husband standing beside a lake house in Colorado. Dylan joked about bringing his twin boys. Rachel shared a photo of the engagement ring everyone was already calling legendary. Then another notification appeared. Tyler Benson and fiancé confirmed. Meredith's thumb froze above the screen. Tyler, the man who had once promised forever beneath the old football stadium lights before leaving her with a quiet text message 2 weeks after graduation. She thought she had buried that memory years ago. Apparently memories had excellent timing. She locked her phone and leaned back in the cushioned chair of the hotel cafe, where she had stopped after finishing a freelance design presentation upstairs. Rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking downtown Chicago, turning the city lights into shimmering streaks of gold. Around her, conversations floated through the warm air. Espresso machines hissed. Silverware chimed gently against porcelain plates. Everyone looked like they belonged somewhere. Meredith wasn't sure she belonged anywhere tonight. She glanced at her reflection in the dark glass. Her navy dress was elegant, but borrowed from her older cousin. Her heels had survived 3 weddings and countless interviews. She looked presentable. She just didn't feel successful. 10 years ago, everyone had expected Meredith Hale to become someone extraordinary. Instead, she rented a small apartment, worked freelance projects from coffee shops, and spent too many nights wondering whether talent alone was enough. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her best friend, Nina. "You're still coming, right? Please don't disappear." Meredith sighed before typing. "Thinking about it." Nina answered instantly. "Don't let Tyler win by staying home." Meredith smiled faintly, but the smile disappeared almost as quickly. It wasn't Tyler she feared anymore. It was the silent comparison, the careful smiles, the questions disguised as compliments. "So, are you seeing anyone? Still single? What have you been up to?" She already knew the sympathetic expressions that would follow her honest answers. She slipped the phone into her purse and whispered to herself, "Maybe I'll just fake the flu." A quiet laugh came from the neighboring table. She turned instinctively. A man sat alone with a black coffee and an untouched slice of cheesecake. He wore a charcoal sport coat without a tie, sleeves rolled neatly to his forearms. His dark blonde hair was slightly windswept from the rain outside. He wasn't staring, but it was obvious he had overheard enough to understand her situation. Meredith immediately looked away, embarrassed. Great. Now strangers knew she was talking to herself. She reached for her laptop, intending to leave before she embarrassed herself further, when another message appeared in the reunion chat. "Can't wait to meet everyone's spouses. We should recreate our senior photo with all our partners." Meredith closed her eyes for a second. That single sentence somehow felt heavier than everything else combined. She exhaled slowly, fighting the ridiculous sting behind her eyes. "You don't cry over reunions," she reminded herself. "You definitely don't cry in hotel cafes." She gathered her things too quickly. Her sketchbook slipped from her bag, landing on the polished floor with several loose pencil drawings sliding across the aisle. Before she could kneel, someone reached them first. Strong hands carefully collected every page, making sure none were bent. He glanced briefly at one drawing of a tiny neighborhood bookstore beneath autumn trees. "You drew these?" he asked. Meredith nodded awkwardly. "Just whenever work gets too stressful." He handed the pages back with surprising care, almost as though they were worth far more than paper. "They're beautiful." "Thank you." She offered an uncomfortable smile. "I guess they're more successful than I am." The stranger studied her expression for a quiet moment, noticing the joke hadn't really been a joke. His eyes shifted toward the reunion invitation still glowing on her phone screen before returning to her face. There wasn't pity there, only recognition. As if he understood exactly what it felt like to walk into a room where everyone expected you to prove your life had mattered. Meredith slid the drawings back into her bag and stood. Anyway, thanks for helping. She turned toward the exit, ready to disappear into the rainy Chicago evening before the reunion became tomorrow's problem. Then, just before she took her second step, the stranger spoke so softly that only she could hear him. If all you need is a boyfriend for one night, Meredith stopped. Her heartbeat stumbled. She slowly turned back toward him. The stranger met her eyes with the calm confidence of someone making the simplest offer in the world. Then, with the faintest smile, he whispered, "Pretend you're with me." Meredith blinked, convinced she had misunderstood him. The cafe seemed to fall strangely quiet, even though nothing around them had changed. Cups still clinked against saucers. Rain still traced slow lines down the tall windows. Somewhere behind the counter, a barista called out another order. Yet all she could hear was the stranger's calm voice repeating inside her mind. "Pretend you are with me." She let out a nervous laugh. That is either the strangest thing anyone has ever said to me, or the kindest. The man smiled, but only slightly. Hopefully both. Meredith studied him for a long moment. There was no arrogance in his expression. No playful grin suggesting this was some elaborate joke. He simply looked like someone who had made a practical suggestion to solve a practical problem. "You do not even know my name," she said carefully. "I know you were about to walk into a reunion expecting to defend your life to people who stopped knowing you 10 years ago," he replied. "Sometimes that is enough." Meredith folded her arms. "That is not exactly reassuring." He nodded as though he understood her hesitation completely. "Fair enough. My name is Callan Mercer." He extended his hand across the small table. She shook it almost automatically. His handshake was warm, steady, and surprisingly ordinary. "Meredith Hale." "Nice to meet you, Meredith." She looked toward the hotel entrance, then back at him. Every sensible part of her mind insisted she should thank him politely and leave. Her mother had spent years reminding her not to trust charming strangers. Yet something about Callan felt different. He was not trying to impress her. If anything, he seemed almost uncomfortable with attention. "Why would you help someone you just met?" she finally asked. Callan glanced toward the rain outside before answering. "Because I have attended enough events to know that appearances usually matter far more than they should." Meredith tilted her head. "You sound like someone who goes to a lot of fancy parties." "More than I would like." "Business." He hesitated for only a heartbeat. "Something like that." Meredith noticed he had answered without actually answering. It reminded her of people who had learned to keep parts of themselves hidden. Before she could ask another question, Callan leaned forward slightly. "There would have to be rules." She raised an eyebrow. "Rules? 3 of them." She could not believe this conversation was becoming real, but curiosity kept her seated. "First," he said, "you never ask me about money. Second, I never ask you to pretend beyond the reunion. Third, when the evening ends, we walk away with no expectations." Meredith stared at him. "That sounds strangely specific." "Specific rules prevent unnecessary complications." "Have you done this before?" His quiet smile returned. "No." "Then how do you sound so prepared?" "Because I dislike chaos." Meredith laughed before she could stop herself. It had been hours since she had laughed naturally. "You really are serious?" "Completely." She rested her elbows on the table, studying him again. "If we are pretending to be together, we need a story." "Agreed." "How did we meet?" "You tell me." Meredith thought for a second. "A bookstore." Callan looked surprised. "Not online." "Definitely not online." She smiled. "Real stories deserve real places." He nodded thoughtfully. "A bookstore it is." "What do you do?" she asked. "Enough to explain why you can attend a reunion on a Saturday evening without asking your boss for permission." He answered with another careful half-truth. "I run a company." Meredith laughed again. "That narrows it down to about 5 million Americans." "Good. Less chance of making a mistake." She noticed he never bragged, never volunteered details, never acted like a man trying to make himself look important. Oddly enough, that made him even more interesting. Callan picked up one of her sketches that still rested beside her coffee cup. It showed an old brick storefront with flowers growing beneath the windows. "You see beauty where most people would keep walking," he said quietly. Meredith shrugged. "Drawing helps me remember that ordinary things still matter." He looked at the sketch a second longer before placing it back exactly where he had found it. "Then perhaps tomorrow night is not about convincing your classmates that your life is impressive." Meredith smiled sadly. "You have clearly never been to a 10-year reunion." Callan stood, and reached for his coat. Tomorrow at 6 o'clock. Hotel lobby. She blinked. You already assume I am saying yes? He looked back over his shoulder with the same calm confidence that had caught her attention from the beginning. No, I simply think you deserve one evening where fear does not make your decisions. Meredith watched him disappear through the revolving doors into the soft rain. She remained seated long after he was gone, staring at the business card he had left beside her untouched coffee. It contained only 3 words. Callan Mercer. No title, no company, no explanation. Somehow, that mystery made saying yes feel even more dangerous. Meredith barely slept that night. Callan's business card rested on her nightstand beside her alarm clock, its clean white surface somehow carrying more weight than the dozens of reunion messages filling her phone. By sunrise, she had convinced herself that accepting his offer was reckless. By breakfast, she had convinced herself that declining it would guarantee an evening of regret. At 5:30 the following afternoon, she stood in front of the mirror of her small apartment, adjusting the borrowed navy dress for what felt like the 100th time. The fabric fit well enough, but confidence could not be borrowed as easily as clothing. Her phone buzzed with another message from Nina. Please tell me you are coming. Everyone is already checking in. Meredith smiled faintly before typing only 2 words. I am coming. She deliberately left out the part that still sounded unbelievable even to her. At exactly 6 o'clock, she stepped into the Grand Magnolia Hotel lobby. Golden chandeliers reflected across polished marble floors while guests drifted through the entrance carrying garment bags and bouquets of flowers. She searched the room nervously, wondering if Callan had changed his mind. Then she noticed him standing near a large arrangement of white lilies. He wore a perfectly tailored dark navy suit that somehow managed to look elegant without demanding attention. He checked his watch, looked up, and smiled the moment he saw her approaching. Right on time, he said. Meredith laughed softly. I almost turned around twice before walking inside. But you did not. I suppose that counts as progress. His eyes briefly met hers before he offered his arm with quiet confidence. Ready? Meredith hesitated for only a second before slipping her hand through his arm. The gesture felt surprisingly natural. Not even a little, she admitted. Good, Callan replied. People who pretend they are never nervous usually are. As they walked toward the ballroom in trance, he spoke calmly, almost like they were reviewing plans for an ordinary meeting. Your classmates do not need perfection. They only need consistency. Smile when you feel comfortable. If someone asks how we met, remember the bookstore. If they ask how long we have been together, say 8 months. If you forget something, look at me before answering. Meredith looked at him with curiosity. Why? Because couples naturally check each other before telling shared stories. She blinked. You have really thought about this. Observation is part of my job. You still have not told me what your job actually is. Callan smiled without answering. Meredith shook her head, already recognizing the familiar pattern. He always revealed just enough to keep the conversation moving while quietly protecting whatever part of his life he did not wish to discuss. They stopped outside the ballroom doors where laughter echoed from inside. Meredith suddenly felt her heartbeat quicken. Through the glass panels, she recognized familiar faces she had not seen in 10 years. Some looked older. Some looked almost exactly the same. Memories returned all at once. Football games on Friday nights. Graduation rehearsals. Shared dreams that had once seemed limitless. Callan noticed her fingers tighten around his sleeve. Without making a scene, he spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. Look at me. She did. You survived every difficult day that came after high school. Tonight is only 3 hours. Meredith took a slow breath. Somehow those words settled the storm inside her chest. A volunteer greeted them with bright enthusiasm and handed Meredith a name tag. Then the young woman looked toward Callan. And you must be the lucky boyfriend. Meredith felt herself freeze for half a second. Before she could answer, Callan smiled warmly and extended his hand. Callan, it is nice to finally meet everyone Meredith has told me so much about. The lie sounded effortless, natural, kind. As the ballroom doors opened, conversations slowed one by one. Heads turned across the room. Several former classmates smiled with surprise. Others exchanged curious glances. Meredith recognized Ashley whispering something to Rachel, while Tyler Benson looked up from his conversation with his fiancée. His confident smile faded almost immediately. He had clearly expected Meredith to arrive alone. Instead, he watched her enter beside a man whose quiet confidence filled the room without saying a word. Meredith suddenly realized something unexpected. For the first time since receiving the reunion invitation, she was no longer thinking about proving anything. She was simply trying to keep up with the stranger whose steady presence somehow made every uncertain step feel easier than the last. The ballroom slowly returned to its cheerful rhythm, but Meredith could feel curious eyes following her with every step. Soft jazz drifted through the room, while old classmates laughed over framed yearbook photos displayed along one wall. Waiters carried trays of sparkling water and appetizers between round tables dressed in white linen. Everything looked polished, comfortable, familiar. Meredith, however, felt as though she had stepped onto a stage without rehearsing enough lines. Callan seemed completely unaffected. He greeted every introduction with the same calm smile, remembering names after hearing them only once, and asking thoughtful questions that encouraged other people to speak about themselves. Meredith quickly noticed something remarkable. He never tried to become the center of attention, yet conversations naturally gathered around him. Ashley approached first, wrapping Meredith in an enthusiastic hug before turning toward Callan with obvious curiosity. "You have been hiding him from us?" she asked with a playful grin. Meredith forced herself to smile naturally. "I guess I have. We met at a bookstore," Callan added smoothly. "She was searching for a design book. I was searching for a business biography. Somehow we both left with coffee instead." Meredith glanced at him, surprised by the tiny detail he had added without making the story sound rehearsed. Ashley laughed. "That is actually adorable." Meredith silently thanked him. The evening continued more easily than she had imagined. Every time an uncomfortable question appeared, Callan answered just enough to move the conversation forward before gently shifting attention back toward someone else. Instead of discussing himself, he complimented family photographs, congratulated classmates on career achievements, and asked about children, volunteer work, and favorite vacation spots. Meredith realized he possessed a rare gift. He made people feel interesting. Even Tyler eventually walked across the ballroom with his fiancée beside him. His smile remained polite, although Meredith could see surprise lingering beneath it. "Meredith," he said, "it has been a long time." "It has," she replied calmly. Tyler extended his hand toward Callan. "Tyler Benson, Callan Mercer." They shook hands with quiet professionalism. Tyler glanced between them. "So how did the two of you meet?" Meredith answered before nervousness could betray her. "A neighborhood bookstore downtown." Tyler nodded slowly. "Interesting. Meredith always loved sketching old buildings. I guess bookstores fit the theme." Callan looked at Meredith with genuine curiosity. "She still sketches almost every day." Tyler blinked. "Really?" Meredith looked at Callan in surprise. She had never actually told him that. Then she remembered the worn sketchbook she had dropped in the cafe. He had simply paid attention. Tyler's fiancée smiled warmly. "You should show us sometime." Meredith felt something unfamiliar growing inside her. Confidence. Not because she was pretending to have the perfect relationship, but because someone beside her quietly noticed the small things she usually believed nobody saw. As Tyler and his fiancée walked away, Nina hurried over carrying 2 glasses of sparkling cider. She hugged Meredith tightly before whispering, "Where did you find this man?" Meredith laughed. "Long story." Nina leaned closer. "He looks familiar." Meredith shrugged. "Maybe you have seen someone who looks like him." Nina continued studying Callan while he spoke with another group across the room. "No, it is something else." Before Meredith could ask what she meant, the master of ceremonies invited everyone to gather for the reunion slideshow. Lights dimmed as photographs from high school filled the large screen. Laughter echoed each time an old hairstyle or awkward yearbook picture appeared. Meredith found herself genuinely smiling. During one photograph of the senior art fair, Callan quietly leaned toward her. "That drawing on the easel? Is that yours?" Meredith looked at the screen and laughed softly. "I cannot believe they found that picture. You were talented then too." "I was mostly hopeful. Sometimes hope is the greater talent." His words lingered with her, long after the next photograph appeared. When the lights brightened again, a middle-aged alumnus approached their table holding a glass of iced tea. He stared at Callan for several seconds before speaking. "I apologize if this sounds strange, but have we met before?" Callan smiled politely. "I do not believe so." The man frowned thoughtfully. "I swear I have seen your face somewhere. Television, maybe." or a magazine. Meredith felt Callan's posture remained perfectly relaxed, yet she noticed the smallest pause before he answered. People say that happens more often than you would think. The man laughed politely and walked away, still looking puzzled. Before Meredith could say anything, another classmate leaned toward Nina and lowered his voice just enough for several nearby guests to hear. I swear I have seen him somewhere before. Maybe on CNBC or one of those business interviews. Nina looked at Callan again, then shrugged. You are probably imagining things. Meredith glanced toward them for a brief second before smiling to herself. She assumed they had simply mistaken him for another businessman and thought nothing more about it. Meredith watched him disappear into the crowd before turning back toward Callan. For the first time since meeting him, she noticed something she had overlooked before. Every time someone came close to recognizing him, he did not become frightened. He simply became careful. And somehow that quiet caution made the mystery surrounding the man beside her even deeper than before. The reunion slowly drifted toward its final hour, and the nervous energy Meredith had carried through the ballroom began to dissolve into something quieter. She was laughing more easily now, sharing old memories with classmates she had once assumed she would never see again. Every so often she caught herself forgetting that the relationship beside her had started as nothing more than an agreement between strangers. Callan never overplayed his role. He never interrupted conversations to impress anyone, never exaggerated stories, never reached for attention. Instead, he quietly refilled her water glass before she noticed it was empty, remembered the names of people she had introduced only once, and somehow made every interaction feel effortless. Meredith wondered if this was simply who he was when nobody was watching. As guests began collecting coats and exchanging final hugs, Tyler approached once more. His expression had softened compared with the confidence he wore earlier that evening. It was good seeing you again, Meredith, he said sincerely. I'm glad things worked out for you. Meredith smiled politely. Thank you, Tyler. I hope everything goes well for you too. Tyler shook Callan's hand one last time. Take good care of her. That is the plan, Callan answered without hesitation. The words sounded simple, but Meredith felt them settle unexpectedly deep inside her heart. A few minutes later, the ballroom emptied into the elegant hotel lobby. Groups gathered near the revolving doors while valets hurried through the cool Chicago evening, retrieving cars. A few minutes later, a single black luxury SUV pulled quietly beneath the hotel entrance. One woman in a tailored business suit stepped out carrying a leather portfolio. She walked directly toward Callan with the practiced calm of someone who had worked beside him for years. Excuse me, Mr. Mercer, she said softly. I am sorry to interrupt. The board moved tomorrow morning's strategy meeting forward. They are waiting on the video call whenever you are ready. Meredith turned toward Callan with genuine gratitude. You did not have to do any of this. He smiled. Neither did you. I almost canceled yesterday. I know. How? Because that is what fear usually tells us to do. She laughed softly. You seem to understand fear better than most people. Before he could answer, the waiting SUV idled quietly beneath the hotel entrance. Meredith felt the world around her slow. Mercer Dynamics. She knew that name. Every business magazine displayed it. Every financial news channel discussed it whenever technology markets shifted. Her eyes widened as scattered memories connected one by one. The magazine cover at the airport. The interview playing silently on a television in a coffee shop months ago. The face she could never quite place. Across the driveway, a young valet whispered excitedly to another employee. That is him. That is Callan Mercer. Meredith looked back at the man standing beside her. The same man who had quietly picked up her sketches from the cafe floor. The same man who had listened instead of boasting. The same man who had claimed he simply ran a company. He had never lied outright. He had simply hidden the scale of the truth. You are, she whispered, unable to finish the sentence. Callan met her eyes with quiet regret. Yes. No dramatic speech followed. No attempt to defend himself. Only one honest word. Meredith suddenly remembered every careful answer he had given during the past 2 days. Every conversation he had redirected, every moment someone had almost recognized him. The mystery that had surrounded him all evening finally disappeared, replaced by a reality even more unbelievable than anything she could have imagined. She stepped back instinctively, not because she feared him, but because the distance between their worlds suddenly felt impossibly large. The borrowed dress, the tiny apartment, the freelance projects. the sketchbook held together by worn corners. On one side stood the ordinary life she understood. On the other stood a man whose name moved markets before sunrise. Callan took a slow step toward her, his voice almost lost beneath the sound of the city. Meredith, I never wanted you to meet the title before you met the man. Meredith stood beneath the covered entrance of the hotel, while the cool evening air carried the scent of rain across the driveway. The line of black vehicles remained perfectly still, their headlights casting pale reflections across the wet pavement. Everything around her suddenly felt unfamiliar. Just minutes earlier, Callan had been a thoughtful stranger who knew how to calm anxious conversations. Now every person around him moved with quiet efficiency, addressing him with unmistakable respect. She searched his face for signs that the man she had spent the evening with had somehow disappeared. Instead, she found the same steady eyes that had looked at her across a cafe table only 2 days before. That almost made everything harder. You should have told me, she whispered. Callan lowered his gaze for a brief moment. I wanted one conversation where nobody treated me differently because of my last name. Meredith let out a slow breath. You let me believe you were just ordinary. I am ordinary in more ways than people imagine. She shook her head gently. You own one of the biggest technology companies in the country. That is my work. It is also your life. A quiet silence settled between them. Neither of them sounded angry. They simply sounded disappointed by a truth that had arrived too late. The assistant quietly checked her watch before looking toward Callan, waiting patiently without interrupting. Meredith noticed the gesture and suddenly realized that dozens of people depended on this man every day. She thought about her tiny apartment, overdue invoices, and the freelance projects she accepted simply to cover rent. Their worlds had never truly crossed. They had only borrowed the illusion that they could. She forced a small smile that did not quite reach her eyes. I think our agreement is finished. Callan looked at her carefully. Meredith, you said there would be no expectations after tonight. I also said you could ask me anything once it was over. She looked away toward the city lights. I do not even know where to begin. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed the business card she had returned to him earlier that evening. Turning it over, he wrote a number across the blank back with a silver pen. This is my direct phone number. Not my assistant. Not my office. Mine. Meredith stared at the card but did not reach for it. I do not belong in your world, Callan. His answer came almost immediately. Who decided that? She smiled sadly. Reality. He stepped closer, careful to leave enough space that she would not feel pressured. Reality is that you are the first person in a very long time who spoke to me before knowing what I own. Meredith finally accepted the card but held it loosely between her fingers. Maybe that is exactly why we should leave things here. A faint shadow crossed his expression. It was not frustration. It looked more like regret. If that is what you truly want, I will respect it. She nodded once, unable to trust herself to say anything else. Turning away, she walked toward the sidewalk where the sounds of evening traffic blended with distant laughter from guests still leaving the reunion. She resisted the urge to look back. She knew that if she saw him standing there, waiting, she might lose the determination she was struggling to hold together. Callan remained where he was until she disappeared around the corner. Only then did he quietly enter the waiting vehicle. As the door closed, his assistant glanced toward him from the front passenger seat. Successful evening? Callan looked out the rain-speckled window instead of answering immediately. Chicago's lights stretched endlessly beyond the glass, while Meredith's borrowed navy dress remained the last image in his mind. I am not sure, he finally admitted. For the first time in years, I forgot what people expected from me. The SUV quietly pulled away from the hotel and disappeared into the city. Across town, Meredith unlocked the door to her apartment, slipped off her heels, and placed the business card on the small kitchen table beside her sketchbook. She stared at it for several quiet minutes before opening the sketchbook to a blank page. Without thinking, her pencil began tracing familiar lines. A pair of thoughtful eyes. A calm smile. The outline of a man standing beneath hotel lights on a rainy night. Halfway through the drawing, she stopped suddenly, closed the sketchbook, and slid both it and the business card into a drawer. It was only pretend, she whispered into the silence of the apartment. Yet no matter how many times she repeated those words, her heart refused to believe them. 3 days passed, yet Meredith found herself glancing at the closed kitchen drawer every morning before making coffee. The business card remained exactly where she had hidden it, untouched, as though ignoring it might somehow quiet the questions that refused to leave her mind. She threw herself into freelance work instead. Logo revisions, website layouts, restaurant menus, anything that kept her eyes fixed on a computer screen instead of replaying every conversation she had shared with Callan. For a while it worked. Then everything changed before lunch on Thursday. Her phone began vibrating nonstop. First Nina called, then Ashley. Then messages poured into the reunion group chat faster than Meredith could read them. Someone had uploaded photographs from the reunion onto social media. Most showed smiling classmates gathered around tables or posing beside the welcome banner. But one image had spread far beyond the reunion page. It showed Meredith and Callan entering the ballroom together, both smiling naturally, completely unaware the photograph had been taken. Beneath the picture, dozens of strangers had already begun speculating. Some recognized Callan immediately. Others invented stories about the unknown woman standing beside one of the country's most recognizable business leaders. Meredith's stomach tightened as she scrolled. A small Chicago business blog reposted the reunion photograph after recognizing Callan. Within hours, several local Chicago business media outlets repeated the story, each adding its own speculation about the mysterious woman beside him. By the following morning, larger national business publications had picked up the same story, turning a private reunion into unexpected public attention. Minutes later, another account claimed the woman had deliberately attended the reunion, hoping to attract his attention. The comments grew harsher with every refresh. People who had never met her confidently described her motives, her personality, even her past. Meredith locked her phone and pushed it across the table as if distance alone could silence the noise. It did not. By afternoon, one of her freelance clients emailed politely asking whether she wished to postpone their meeting until the unexpected media attention settled down. Another client quietly canceled an upcoming project without explanation. Meredith sat motionless in her apartment, realizing that complete strangers now believed they understood her life better than she did. Across the city, the executive conference room at Mercer Dynamics overlooked the Chicago skyline through floor-to-ceiling windows. Quarterly reports covered the long walnut table while directors discussed expansion strategies. Callan listened without hearing a single word. His attention remained fixed on the tablet lying beside his notebook. Every few minutes, another article appeared, each one repeating the same speculation, while Meredith's photograph remained displayed beneath sensational headlines. One board member finally noticed his silence. "Is everything all right, Callan?" He closed the tablet gently. "Excuse me for a moment." Without another word, he stepped into the hallway and called his communications director. "How bad?" he asked quietly. "The stories are multiplying," she admitted. "Most outlets are repeating the same story. If we ignore it, the cycle may continue through the weekend." Callan looked through the glass toward the conference room where executives waited patiently for his return. Normally, he would have chosen silence. He had spent years refusing to answer gossip. This time felt different. "Schedule a press statement for 4 o'clock. The director hesitated. "You almost never respond publicly." "I am not responding for myself." The following afternoon, Mercer Dynamics held its regularly scheduled quarterly press conference to discuss earnings, expansion plans, and upcoming investments. Near the end of the session, one reporter unexpectedly raised a different question. "Mr. Mercer, would you like to comment on the recent photographs from your class reunion?" Callan answered without hesitation. "Meredith Hale is a talented graphic designer and an honest person who deserves privacy and respect. She did not seek publicity, financial gain, or personal advantage. Any attention directed toward her exists only because of my public position, not because of any action she took." Reporters immediately raised their hands, eager for more details. "Is she your girlfriend?" one asked. Callan paused for only a second. "She is someone whose kindness deserves better than internet speculation." Another reporter asked whether the relationship had been staged for publicity. Callan's voice remained steady. "Nothing about Meredith's character has ever been staged." Hundreds of miles away, Meredith watched the live broadcast from her apartment television with disbelief. He could have denied everything. He could have protected only his own reputation. Instead, he had stepped in front of cameras simply to defend someone who had already walked away from him. For the first time since leaving the reunion, Meredith realized the man she had tried so hard to forget had just risked public curiosity to protect her name without asking for anything in return. The interview replayed across every major news channel before the evening was over, yet the part Meredith remembered most was not the questions. It was the quiet certainty in Callan's voice when he defended someone who had already chosen to walk away from him. He had not tried to turn the moment into a dramatic confession. He had not asked for sympathy. He had simply protected her dignity. That night, Meredith sat beside the window of her apartment watching rain gather on the glass. The same gentle rain that had fallen outside the hotel cafe where everything had begun. The business card remained on the kitchen table instead of hidden away in the drawer. For nearly an hour she stared at it before finally picking up her phone. She typed a dozen different messages and erased every one of them. Thank you sounded too small. I am sorry sounded incomplete. Eventually she set the phone down again. Across the city, Callan dismissed the last member of his executive team long after sunset. His office overlooked the glowing skyline. But instead of reviewing contracts, he found himself studying a framed sketch that leaned quietly against the bookshelf. It was the bookstore drawing Meredith had accidentally left behind in the cafe before he returned it. After the reunion, she had forgotten one loose practice sketch tucked inside a folder, and he had noticed it only after arriving home. He had intended to mail it back. Instead, it became a daily reminder that the most meaningful conversations of his life had happened with someone who never cared how successful he was. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. His longtime assistant stepped inside. Your dinner reservation is waiting. Callan smiled faintly. Cancel it. Again. Again. She nodded, with understanding before quietly closing the door. The office grew silent once more. Meanwhile, Meredith opened her sketchbook for the first time since the reunion. She turned past unfinished buildings, cafes, quiet streets, and familiar city corners until she reached the portrait she had stopped drawing days earlier. Looking at it now, she realized something surprising. She had captured Callan's expression perfectly, but she had completely missed the loneliness behind his eyes. Suddenly, she remembered something he had said during their first meeting. Sometimes appearances matter more than they should. At the time, she thought he had been talking about her reunion. Now she wondered if he had really been describing his own life. After watching the interview several more times, Meredith finally picked up the business card. She stared at the handwritten number before sending a short message. I think we should talk. If you are free tomorrow afternoon, meet me at the Botanical Garden. 20 minutes later, his reply arrived. I will be there. The following afternoon, Meredith took the train downtown and walked toward the Botanical Garden, a peaceful place where she often sketched during quiet weekends. To her surprise, she found Callan already sitting on a wooden bench overlooking a fountain, dressed simply in a light sweater and dark jeans with no security team in sight. He looked up almost immediately, as though he had sensed she might come. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. Finally, Meredith sat beside him. How did you know this was my favorite place? Callan smiled gently. One of your sketches. She laughed softly. You really do notice everything. Not everything. His voice grew quieter. I almost failed to notice that hiding the truth would hurt you more than telling it. Meredith looked toward the fountain where children floated small paper boats across the shallow water while parents watched nearby. Why did you really offer to help me that night? She asked. Callan rested his hands together before answering. Because I recognized the look on your face. She turned toward him. What look? The one that says you are tired of pretending everything is fine. He drew a slow breath before continuing. My family has spent 2 years trying to arrange introductions, business dinners, and relationships that looked perfect on magazine covers. Every room I entered expected something from me before anyone asked who I actually was. When I heard you talking in the cafe, I realized you were trying to escape a different kind of performance. You needed someone to stand beside you for one evening. The truth is, he paused, searching for words he rarely allowed himself to say aloud. I needed someone to stand beside me too. Meredith felt her eyes fill with quiet emotion. So when you whispered those words, I was not only rescuing you from an uncomfortable reunion. He looked directly into her eyes with complete honesty. I was hoping, for just one night, to escape being treated like a billionaire and remember what it felt like to simply be Callan. Meredith smiled through the silence. The distance that had seemed impossible only days earlier suddenly felt much smaller. Not because their lives had changed, but because the truth between them finally had. 1 year passed more quickly than either of them expected. What began as a promise lasting only one evening slowly became quiet breakfasts before work, long walks through neighborhood streets, afternoons spent in bookstores, and evenings where Meredith sketched while Callan answered the last of his emails without pretending to be anyone else. They never rushed the relationship. They built it one honest conversation at a time. Meredith continued growing her design studio, earning clients because of her talent rather than her connection to Callan. Whenever people assumed success had been handed to her, she simply smiled and let her work answer for itself. Callan admired that more than any headline or award. He quietly supported her dreams without trying to direct them. When she finally opened a small creative studio with large windows overlooking a tree-lined street, the first framed drawing hanging near the entrance was not of a famous landmark. It was the little bookstore she had once described during their imaginary first date. Beneath the drawing rested a small, handwritten note. Every true story begins with one honest conversation. Callan visited often, never announcing himself, usually carrying 2 cups of coffee from a neighborhood cafe they had grown to love. One crisp autumn afternoon, Meredith received an invitation unlike any she had expected. Mercer Dynamics Foundation was hosting its annual charity gala benefiting young artists and community education programs, and Callan invited Meredith as his guest. This time there would be no pretending, no rehearsed story, no borrowed role. As they entered the ballroom together, many guests greeted Meredith by name. Several of them had worked with her through the foundation's community art projects during the past year. She quickly realized Callan had spoken about her long before introducing her publicly, not as a billionaire's companion, but as an artist who reminded him to slow down and notice beauty in ordinary moments. During the evening, Callan stepped onto the stage to thank the donors, volunteers, community partners, and employees who made the foundation possible. He spoke about innovation, responsibility, and teamwork before unexpectedly setting his prepared remarks aside. "There is one more person I need to thank," he said. The room grew quiet. Meredith looked up in surprise as he walked down from the stage, instead of remaining behind the podium. He stopped directly in front of her, his expression calm, sincere, and wonderfully familiar. "A year ago," he began, "I met someone who believed she needed a perfect story to walk into a reunion. The truth is, I was the one hiding behind appearances. She reminded me that success means very little if nobody truly knows the person behind it." He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully unfolded a small piece of white paper. It was the original business card from the cafe, the one with his personal phone number written on the back in silver ink. Meredith recognized it immediately. He smiled as he held it between them. "This little card was supposed to be the end of our agreement. Instead, it became the beginning of my favorite chapter." Then he reached into his other pocket and revealed a simple ring. It was elegant, timeless, and intentionally understated. No dramatic spotlight, no orchestra, only quiet honesty. He lowered himself onto one knee while the ballroom watched in complete silence. "The first time I asked you to stand beside me, it was only for one night. Today I want to ask something completely different." Meredith felt tears gathering before he even finished speaking. "Will you stop pretending forever and become my wife?" She laughed through happy tears, remembering every uncertain step that had brought them to this moment. The rainy cafe, the reunion, the business card, the bookstore that had existed only in an imaginary story before becoming part of their real lives. She nodded before she could even find her voice. "Yes," she whispered. Then she laughed again, this time completely for real. Meredith reached into the small leather bag resting beside her chair and carefully pulled out the same worn sketchbook she had carried into the hotel cafe more than a year earlier. "I have something for you," she said softly. Callan smiled as she opened the very first page. It showed the quiet cafe where 2 strangers had accidentally changed each other's lives. "You finally finished the drawing," he said with a gentle laugh. Meredith smiled and slowly turned to the final page. This time the sketch showed 2 people standing together in front of a cozy neighborhood bookstore beneath golden autumn trees. "No," she whispered warmly. "Now I did." Applause filled the ballroom as Callan gently slipped the ring onto her finger and stood to embrace her. Months later, their wedding took place in a quiet botanical garden surrounded by close friends and family instead of cameras. Nina cried through the ceremony. Ashley joked that Meredith had somehow managed to keep the greatest surprise of the reunion hidden after all. Even Tyler sincerely wished them happiness, finally understanding that life was never a competition measured by appearances. Near the reception entrance stood a framed sketch of a cozy bookstore beside a single business card displayed beneath glass. Guests smiled curiously at the unusual keepsake until Meredith quietly explained that every meaningful journey begins with one small act of courage. Sometimes it is saying hello to a stranger. Sometimes it is telling the truth before it is comfortable. And sometimes the greatest love story of your life begins with two people who stop pretending and finally allow themselves to be seen exactly as they are. After all, the best stories always find their way to real places. If you enjoyed this story, please like, share, and subscribe to the Billionaire's Choice. Every week, we bring you heartwarming stories of love, destiny, and life-changing decisions. Don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss a new story.